So when I talk about panels, you'll start doing jumping jacks, right? Okay, I'm going to start. Okay, so I like putting the name paragraphs in the names of my talks because I find I get a lot more people showing up. So I hope you're all in the right spot. I'll try and talk about it a little bit. So I'm going to be talking today about how, just some thoughts about how to set up your content architecture in Drupal. And for those of you who I haven't met, my name is Suzanne Dergacheva. I work at Evolving Web in Montreal. It's a Drupal agency that I co-founded a little over 10 years ago. And since then, I've worked in Drupal in many different capacities, primarily as a front-end developer, but I've also done lots of other things. I do Drupal training, and I'm on the board of the Drupal Association. So I like to get involved in lots of different Drupal things. And a little bit about Evolving Web. So we're a Drupal agency. We are up in Montreal, Canada, and we are hiring. So if anyone wants to move to Canada, here's the thing. Come talk to me. And I also, I run a Drupal training as part of my job. So I go around teaching people Drupal. So if that's something you're interested in, please come talk to me as well. So what I'm really going to focus on today is how to structure content in Drupal at a high level. So how do you decide how to architect your Drupal site? So how many of you would consider yourselves site builders? Some kind of site builder, configurer. How many of you have made a content type before? Or a block? Yeah, so pretty much all of you have raised your hand. So that means that you are actually architects. So whether, you know that, does anyone here watch Seinfeld? You know, George is always like, I'm an architect. He goes around and pretends to be an architect. Like, well, we can all say that we're architects, I think, legitimately. We go around and we structure Drupal content. And you do this whenever you go in and you decide, oh, these things are going to be nodes, and these things are going to be taxonomy terms, and these things are going to be blocks. And in Drupal, these days, when you're building a site, you have a lot of options for how you're going to build things. There's a lot of ways to do things. And sometimes it's overwhelming as a site builder. You have a lot of options. There's not just one way to build out a certain kind of page. And I'm sure all of you have noticed that in web design trends in the last few years, there's also been a change in the types of pages that we get. So like 10 years ago when I started making websites, you'd create a website and there'd be a lot of pages of content, like these paragraphs and paragraphs of content. You know what I'm talking about? Like you go and you create an About Us page and it's like, there's 5 paragraphs about us. Like what more do you want? Like there's maybe a little picture at the top and that's your page. And now we see content that's more and more visual, that's more broken up into these chunks of kind of content that people are going to find easier to read. And with Drupal, we also have a lot of structured content. So we have content that's broken down into lots of fields. We have content that's really searchable. We have content that models a lot of things in the real world. And so when faced with actually creating this in Drupal, we have these different options. So this is just kind of how I see like some of the main options you have for how you're going to build out something on your site. So you have nodes, so traditional Drupal building blocks, pieces of content, but then we also have taxonomy terms, custom blocks, which are more powerful in Drupal 8 than before, paragraphs. So I'm sure a lot of you have used paragraphs, yeah? That's why you're here. You're like, yeah, paragraphs is in the title. I'm here. And then custom entities and fields, which are these more granular pieces in our architecture. OK, so whenever I talk about Drupal site architecture, I know that some of you are more experienced than others. So I just want to give you a bit of terminology to help you understand what I'm talking about, and just as like a takeaway for understanding documentation when you're looking stuff up later. So in Drupal 8, we talk about entities. And this is super confusing because entities refer to lots of different things in Drupal. In Drupal 8, a content entity just means a piece of content. And it refers to nodes, so all of our pages of content. But it also refers to lots of other types of content, like taxonomy terms, users, comments. It refers to custom blocks as well. So all these pieces of content that live in Drupal are called content entities. And then just to disambiguate, there's also something called a config entity. So if you hear about a config entity, those are pieces of configuration. So that's not talking about content per se. It's just like, oh, you went in and checked some checkboxes, and now you have a field. So that's a piece of configuration. Or you went and checked some checkboxes, and now you have a content type, or a view, and that's going to be another piece of configuration. So config entities are on the configuration side. You'll also hear the word fieldable. Has anyone heard this word before? It kind of sounds like a made-up word. Fieldable, like you can stick fields onto something. So fieldable means that something, you can go into the configuration of Drupal. You can go in as an administrator and create fields. So you have that Manage Fields tab, right? You have Manage Fields, and then you also get Manage Display and Manage Form Display alongside that. So a lot of the content entity types, like nodes and taxonomy terms, those are fieldable. So it means you can go and configure them and customize them really easily. And then we have something called a bundle. So who here has heard of bundles? Yeah, you're going to see the word bundle sticking up sometimes when you go into configure Drupal, and this throws you off sometimes. But a bundle is just a name for a type of content entity type. So it's a subtype. So if you think of, so to simplify this, so if you think of something like nodes are broken down into different content types, right? So you can have your event content, you can have your articles, and each of these is a bundle. So bundle is just another name for content type. But when you talk about taxonomy terms, we'll use the word vocabulary. So bundle also refers to what we call vocabularies. So bundles can have different fields attached to them. So the point of having a bundle is that not every node is the same, not every taxonomy term is the same. Some of them are going to have different kinds of fields. So bundles are what let us distinguish between these types. And then we have something called base fields. So base fields are fields that you can't add or remove from the content entity types. So if we look back at these things, so you take any node, you take any term, there's certain fields that are part of a node that are added programmatically that the site builder can't just go and take away. You've probably built at some point, or you've thought about this, there's a content type that you want to create, like a contact person, and you want them to have a first name and a last name, but you don't want them to have the title field. But you can't take away the title field, there's no delete link on it. And that's because that's a base field. So it's like a field that's inherent, it has to be part of the node. To have a node, you have to have a title. To have a taxonomy term, it has to have a name. And so each content entity type has these types of base fields that are just stuck in there programmatically. Okay, so you've got kind of this little bit more background information. Some of you now maybe feel a little bit more knowledgeable about what these things are. So I'm going to talk about the different content entity types and why you might pick them. So first of all, nodes. Nodes we think of as just being kind of this default way to create content in Drupal. But really, when you think about a node, essentially a node is when you go to a certain path on your site and you get a bunch of content printed out in the main content area. So that's what a node is. So if that's what you want, if you want to be generating these pages of content, you're probably creating nodes. And the nice thing about nodes in Drupal, because they're the thing that's been around a long time and everyone uses them to create pages of content. So they have functionality built in things like if you want to have content that's part of a content moderation workflow, or if you want to have content that's really easy to translate. If you want to have content that works well with other modules, like the groups module or something, then nodes are the best bet, because nodes are what all these other modules kind of integrate with. Terms are, the way that terms excel is really in the fact that they can live in a hierarchy, and they can be used to categorize content. So terms also have a path. Like if you create a term, you're essentially creating a piece of content, and you have a path that you can go to, and you see the term. But then you also see all the content that the term is used to categorize, to tag. So usually terms aren't just like standalone things. Usually they have a bunch of content that belongs to them. And so that's something to consider when you're deciding, should something be a node, should something be a term? You want to think about, does it have to live in a hierarchy? Is it used to organize things, or is it really like the content that's being organized? Then custom blocks. So who here is using custom blocks? Like you're going in, you go to that block library in Drupal 8 now, and you go and add blocks. And some of you have probably noticed that blocks in Drupal 8 are pretty awesome. They have fields on them. So now blocks are fieldable. We can go in and customize them, and we can create new types of blocks, not just like the standard title and body. You can go in and add, videos to your blocks, or you can add a whole bunch of images. You can make little slideshows. You can make advertisements. You can do all kinds of things with blocks now. And we actually had this in Drupal 7. There was a module called Bean. Did anyone use Bean? We used it for multilingual sites because we wanted to be able to translate blocks. And so if you made them into beans, you could translate them. But anyway, the idea is that custom blocks can be really flexible. So you can make more like little patterns out of your blocks. So that's another building block that you have to build out content on your site. You can use custom blocks. And custom blocks don't have a path, right? So if you're creating a custom block, it's great because you don't have a new page on your site. But you have some content that you can stick on other pages. So they're really nice for that. And they integrate into the whole block layout system, so you can go and stick your blocks, in any of your regions, but you can also go and attach them to other content. So you could go and say, oh, this block is actually a banner that belongs to this node, and it should be printed out somewhere on the node. So you can have, you can use custom blocks in different ways, but typically you use them to display content that gets repeated somehow. And then we have paragraphs. So this is the cool new kid. I mean, not that new anymore, but still something people are excited about. And paragraphs, it's probably the one with the worst name, like the name that doesn't describe it very well, because usually when people hear about paragraphs for the first time, they're thinking about that About Us page I was talking about earlier, where you have 5 paragraphs of text, and that does not describe paragraphs very well. So a paragraph is described better as a collection of fields that you can stick within one of your other pieces of content. So if you wanted to have, for example, a page with a bunch of subsections on it that have some fields that you've defined, you can define those fields using paragraphs. One example of that could be like an event. Maybe you have an event that repeats many, many times. You're holding it at different locations throughout the year. But the actual event content remains the same. So you want to have an event node, but then you want to have this event instance that you repeat on the page. And you want each event instance to have a location and a date and to print out one by one in a consistent way. So you could create that event instance as a paragraph and then stick it onto your node. Lots of other ways to use paragraphs as well. You can get really creative with them. So paragraphs don't have a path. And you can't go and just create one. So that's really the thing that defines it. It's not something that you just go and create in its standalone content. It's something that you're going in and attaching to another piece of content. And then finally, you have custom entities. So entities that you can define yourself. So maybe you decide you want to have contacts that you're managing as part of your website. And you don't necessarily want them to have the same base fields as the other ones. Maybe you don't want them to have URLs. Maybe you want to have some custom logic behind them. And maybe you want to attach them to your nodes in a particular way. So you can go in and define your own new types of content that are completely customized. And then you can also use fields within all of these content entity types to customize your content. And you can use existing types of fields, or you can create your own. So having fields is also a way that you're defining the content at a more granular level. OK, so you have all these options for structuring content. So nobody said that the job of a site builder is easy. You have a lot of ways to build things. So I'm going to talk through a couple different use cases. So first of all, when we think about content in Drupal, probably the reason that a lot of us are using Drupal is because Drupal does content types really well, just like standard, traditional nodes, where you have a bunch of fields that you want to attach to a node. And this is this first use case. So when I think about structured content, I think about a node with a bunch of specific fields. So for example, you might have an event content type that has a date and a location, and you're using that location data really specifically to put it on a map. Maybe you're using the date to put it into a calendar. So you need these specific pieces of data to display the node the way that you want to. So this is a really good model for when your content has to be really consistent. When you want it to be searchable, so when we think of how content's going to be used on our site, we might think first of all about the display, but you also want to think about like logically how people are going to find your content. Or if Preston did some of those demos earlier, if you want your content to be used in other contexts, like not on a website, but maybe on a sign somewhere, like you need to make sure that the data that's needed to do that is part of the content. So well-defined content is super valuable. And sometimes well-defined content might also have some flexible content attached to it. So I was talking about the paragraph style content earlier, where you can have some kind of sub content types attached to your content. And so maybe your event has that. Maybe your event has these event instances that you attach to it. So going another step deeper. So maybe you have a lot of well-structured content, something like a university website that has lists of courses and programs, lists of events, profiles of people, all this really well-structured content. And then sometimes in your content architecture, when you're drawing out the map of, OK, here's all the types of content I need, sometimes there's some arrows on that map. Has anyone ever drawn a map like that? Like you've got this content architecture, and there's arrows that start to be drawn everywhere. So this is when we start to have interrelated content. So content doesn't just live on its own somewhere in the database, and you pull out one piece at a time. You actually have a lot of relationships. And these relationships actually exist in Drupal without us even creating them. So if you were actually like a real database nerd and you went in and you drew the databases out, then you'd have all kinds of arrows that were already there. Because when we create nodes, there's always a user of that node. And when we update nodes, there's always node revisions. So there's actually a bunch of relationships that already exist in Drupal without us having to create them. But then sometimes you do need, often if your site has any complexity at all, you will be creating relationships. And we create those relationships all the time with reference fields, right? So when you go in and you create your content types and you have those arrows, you create the arrows in Drupal by adding reference fields. And when you look at the list of field types, there's a whole bunch of reference fields available, including things like the image field, because an image is actually another kind of entity that you're pointing to. The interesting ones here I find are node references and term references, because this is where we're building up relationships between the important bits of content on our site. So you're using relationships to model like real life business things, like, okay, a course always belongs to a program, or a course always has to have an instructor. And so you create these relationships to build those models. And when you're building up relationships in content, you always want to think through the process of how content actually gets created. So you want to make sure that, like if you're building up this courses and programs example, that are programs created first and then we're adding the courses to the programs, or is it the opposite? Do we create the courses first and then build up the programs afterwards? And how should these relationships be created? Because relationships in Drupal always have this kind of direction. Like the arrow has an arrow on one end. So in the process of creating content, you have to know what's created first. And a big question here is always about taxonomy terms. Do you want to create a whole bunch of taxonomy terms in advance and get people to use those when you're creating nodes, or is it kind of something that's done more organically? Okay, so Drupal's great for creating structured content. It has these tools, these references for building kind of interrelated content. And now we have the new kid on the block, the cool like trendy design, landing page style content, your multi-purpose content, where you build kind of like an empty box where users can go in and create the structure of their own content. And this is where paragraphs has become really popular in the last few years, because people don't want all of their content to be well-structured content where they have 20 required fields that they have to enter for each piece of content. They want to allow content marketers and people with some kind of design sensibility to be able to go into the website and create nodes that are very flexible and have all these different paragraph components that can be added and combined in different ways. So this is useful for any content that has more of a communications purpose, more of a marketing message that needs to be flexible, so that it's not just something that looks the same from day to day. So for example, a lot of times, you launch a website and the marketing team has this one idea of like, oh, this website is going to have this particular message and these visuals. And we're going to launch it and people are going to love it. And then 6 months later, you get a new marketing director, and the marketing director says, actually, we have this whole other campaign, and now we have to redo the website. And this happens, right? Like, this happens sometimes before you even launch the website. That's even worse. Yeah, so that's even worse. It happens, and then you have to change everything, and it's like, oh, we actually have to redesign the website because somebody didn't like the landing page or the home page or something like this. And then you have to go back and do all this front-end development. So the idea behind these more multi-purpose types of content is that you're building more of a framework. You're not just building something that's set in stone, but something that's more flexible. Okay, so this works really well with paragraphs, and paragraphs is kind of the way that I think a lot of people are going. I'm seeing it more and more. I heard the number 25% of Drupal sites have paragraphs installed, but I feel like that might be higher for new sites built with Drupal 8. But I want to bring up another model here, because paragraphs is not part of Drupal core, even though a lot of people are using it. And paragraphs is kind of like one option for how to do things. But back at the beginning, I mentioned that there were many different ways to model your content. And one of those is with custom blocks. And so there's nothing to say that we can't use blocks to create this kind of magazine-style marketing content rather than paragraphs. With paragraphs, you can create these references to all sorts of paragraphs, but you can also create different block types. with fields because blocks are also fieldable. And you can set up block reference fields that allow you to do the same sort of thing. And the nice thing about using blocks is that blocks are also, you know, an entity type in their own right, and they can be used throughout your site. They can be reused, and they can be placed on the block layout page as well as referenced from your pieces of content. And so it's something to consider whether you want to go with this paragraphs route, paragraphs being something that you can only create through a node, through creating a node, or whether you want to create blocks, which you could then go off and reuse for other purposes. So it's also an option. And there's modules. There's a block field module, and there's an inline entity form module that you can use to help you with the interface for this, because obviously you don't want to send your content authors over to some other page to create blocks and then back here to create the node. You want to create a streamlined interface. So if you're going to do anything nice for your content editors, you know, make sure that they're able to edit all of this content in one place. But I want to propose blocks as an alternative to paragraphs if you want your content to be more reusable, and if you don't want to go off and use paragraphs for absolutely everything.
Use matters, you can actually have a paragraph type that is a block.
That reference is a block. Yeah. You can. There could be way more arrows. I could have made a lot more of these slides with more complexity. Thank you. Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, so who here is a developer? Yeah, so some developers, they see paragraphs, and maybe you're one of these grumbly folks who's like, oh, paragraphs, it's like very much like a lot of complicated extra configuration. Why don't we just create custom fields and custom entities for all of these things? So this is an option. So if you have some content that you want to predefine and you want to create it more simply so that it's not maybe so much overhead of having all these paragraphs and paragraph types to manage. Maybe you want to use a custom entity. Maybe your custom entities have some special properties in this relationship between the nodes and the kind of sub-content that you're creating. And so there is always that option of creating custom entity types for these things. And so I would suggest that this might be a good option depending on how you're going to use the content. So typically when I'm talking about this example back here, where you have this magazine style content and you want marketing people to be able to dictate what's displayed on the page, usually you're taking all these content components, like calls to action, the web forms, the views, the images, all the text and images, and you're just displaying them on the page and making that page look really pretty. But I've seen people use this kind of structure with paragraphs referenced from a node to do some more complex things. Like, for example, here maybe our node is a university program, and then all of these things are courses. And then we want to take all this data and use it in other ways, in other parts of the site. And we want to use these arrows, like these relationships, to display the content in a lot of views. And we need to be pulling in like the parent or the children all over the place. And sometimes it's hard to do this with paragraphs, the way that it's set up. And so creating a custom entity type might be a better option in that case.
I find a good analog for this use case. If it were to be a row in a database table, and it doesn't really be its own page or anything like that, that's often a good use case for a custom.
Yeah, if you're thinking about it from a developer perspective.
The data perspective.
Yeah.
I mean, kind of a good use case for customized paragraphs is we have a product node and it has the standard text and where you go for a trial. is part of the content type, and then we have a paragraph that is a call to action where you just select the product, and then the code behind the paragraph goes out to the product node, gets the text, the call to action, gets the where to go for the trial, and generates the call to action on the paragraph where it was put. So.
Yeah.
It's Drupal. You can do things multiple ways, and there's no right way.
A custom field might also be a good option. So if what you're creating, instead of creating like a lot of references, like references in databases mean that you have more work to do to get that data back out of the database. If you can create something as a field, it might be a better option. So for example, if what you're referencing just has like 2 little fields on it and you're creating a ton of them, creating a custom field for that is not a very large programming task. And like having one custom module, if you're going to use that content a lot, it's going to be easier to maintain, I think, in the long run. So you want to think about whether the content you're creating is really this kind of magazine-style content, or is it more of the structured content and you're just kind of using paragraphs as a stopgap approach? If it's more of the structured content, that's maybe when you're thinking more of creating a custom entity or a custom field. Okay, so then sometimes you're going to say, yeah, but Suzanne, like it's all of those things. So I know that probably a lot of you are site builders, you're working on projects, you build out some great kind of landing page, and then somebody thinks, maybe you've had this happen to you, that every page on the website is a landing page. Has anyone had that happen? Like, I have these great paragraphs, why can't I use them everywhere? Or like, I have this call to action, can I add that on every single page? But a different one on every page. So sometimes people want everything. You want the well-structured part of the content. You also want to have these cool component-style content, like the blocks or the paragraphs that you can mix and match. And then maybe you also want to have like the predefined paragraph types that are more like the event instance example. Maybe you also have something that could be represented as a custom field or a custom entity. So you might end up with a particularly interesting content type that just has all of these use cases. And that is actually okay. You just have to be thinking through each use case. So remember that the well-structured content is really needed if you want your content to be searchable and displayed in very specific ways. If you want it to be kind of interoperable and like useful elsewhere, having well-defined content is really valuable. Having the kind of magazine-style content, the content where the user gets to create the structure, that's really powerful as like a visual tool for marketers who want control over the look of the site. So maybe there's some aspect of your content that should have that functionality. And then maybe you also have some of this kind of content where it could be even on the same node where you have something that is more customized and should be represented as a custom entity or a field. So you can actually combine these things together. It's just important to remember that every time you're adding fields or adding blocks and paragraphs, you are adding complexity to your site. So the thing to think ahead about is, okay, how am I going to keep this all up to date? How am I going to keep it all, how am I going to migrate it all if I ever have to migrate it somewhere else? This is a lot of content relationships and things. I was just going to say, but then I was like, I'm in Atlanta. Does anyone really care? So I'm really glad that you said that. If you are translating content, translating paragraphs is not a great experience because you have to add paragraphs in the original language before you can translate them. So anytime you're adding additional kind of functionality, it often affects your content, and so the more complex your content is, it just kind of spirals. So always ask why. As a site builder, you want to ask why before you're building out these fields and these components, just so that you make sure you're picking the right content architecture and that you kind of know the implications of what you're building. Okay, so what not to do? So it's a balancing act. So there's two kind of use cases for content. We have content that's really well structured. We have content that's kind of flexible, build your own, or mix and match your components kind of magazine style content. So we have these two ideas. And structured content could be really rigid, right? It can be like, okay, you have to have these 20 fields and they're all required and they all have validation logic on them. And then on the other side, you might have this kind of paragraph content where the content author can pick the background color of each paragraph, and they can pick the image that's used, and they can change the font size, and they have all this flexibility because you've built these paragraphs that, like, there's lots of them and there's lots of settings on them. And so there's this kind of like these two opposites, like really structured content and really flexible content. And the more structured your content is, the more your authors are going to kind of be like, what? Like, I have to create my content like this. Like, I'm not happy with this experience. And the more flexible your content is, the more you're going to end up with content that's not accessible, because nobody's thought about the hierarchy of the HTML and nobody's thought about whether the colors match. And the more that your site is going to look like kind of somebody just created it in, what's that program? Dreamweaver. Because somebody just went and said, oh, I want it to be all these colors, and I'm mixing and matching all these different types of content together. So what you're creating when you're creating the content architecture of your site is you're actually striking a balance between those two things, something really rigid and something that can be much more flexible. And you just have to make sure you have a reason for what you're doing. So
it's not all or none for a site. You could have a lot of content which has to be creative, but product content which is much more rigid. Exactly,
yeah. You could have both. You could have a really flexible homepage. You could have a really structured like product pages. And that's great. It's just, you just have to have a reason for what you're doing. And you have to realize how much rigidity or flexibility you're building in. And I think, yeah, like what I see now is people are going in the direction of building out this kind of model with the paragraphs that's super flexible because it's cool. You can build something super flexible. But I'm seeing the issues coming up now with accessibility and lack of like good design consistency. And so that's something I would say more to watch for, just as like a what not to do. So I hope this gave you some thoughts about how to structure your content. Maybe going back and working on the project you're working on right now, or starting off your next project. You'll have some new ideas about how to structure things. I think that the best thing to do when you're a site builder is ask lots of questions. You know, it's easy to say like, oh yeah, I can build that with Drupal. Drupal's super flexible. I have all these ways to build things. But it's important to ask why. So it's important to think about why you're building something a certain way, and often it all comes down to what the content is for, what the authoring experience needs to be, and how the content is essentially going to be used. So I hope this was helpful. Couple closing thoughts again. We're hiring at Evolving Web, so just some cool little postcards from back home in Montreal. And we do have some training, Drupal training coming up in Atlanta. So if you're interested in either of those things, come talk to me afterwards. And thank you. Merci. Does anyone have comments, questions? Yes.
How do blocks, paragraphs, and custom entities, how do they compare in terms of performance?
Oh, in terms of performance. You know, everything's cached. Okay, there's a performance issue perhaps in the editing interface. Like when you're editing a node and there's really a ton of paragraphs, that can be an issue. And maybe things like migrations more, because if you're migrating the content, so if for some reason like you're taking the content on a regular basis and migrating it, I would imagine there would be some issues there if you're saving things as blocks and paragraphs rather than custom entities. But in terms of displaying all of this, that is, I don't think it would make a difference.
And in terms of the editing paragraphs, they've got a new experimental interface it's getting pretty solid record using it, that simplifies editing in paragraphs so you can collapse things down.
Absolutely, yeah. So definitely huge, good advice there. This thing where you're using nodes and referencing paragraphs, make sure you go to the Manage Form Display interface if you're doing this, and customize the way that paragraphs are being added to nodes, because you can you have lots of options for collapsing them and making that experience better.
I'd like to do a shout out to the ECK module.
Oh, yeah.
Because sometimes we use that. We have an entity type that does with that called pageless nodes, and it's for things that really never end up on a page, but like we use it for like gallery types or sidebar for tab content. So if it's
yeah.
stuff you're going to use in code or use in.
Yeah. So if you're thinking like, oh, I should build a custom entity, check out the ECK module, because it's like a module to help you out with that, so you don't have to write so much custom code. Other thoughts? Things that I missed? Other kinds of like content that you're like, it's not structured, it's not magazine. Something completely different. Yes.
Could we see the interrelated content one more time?
The interrelated content. Oh. Like this part? Anyone else? Anyone want to do some more jumping jacks? Okay, thanks everyone for coming, and I'll chat to you all in the hallway.